Welcome to this, which is the second of our three climate seminars that we'll be running throughout June. Thank you to those of you who joined last week, where we had a particular focus on the cost of living crisis and how it might be interacting with how people think about climate change and the transition to net zero. This seminar is going to be particularly focused on populism and the risk of a populist backlash against net zero. It's actually quite central to the work that we've been doing over the past year. When we started this particular project, one of our sort of concerns was that when we came out of the financial crisis, perhaps the last big major event like the pandemic, lots of us were unprepared for the rise of populism that came afterwards. And it caught us off guard. And we wanted to do this project to sort of identify, what are the risks? What is going to emerge from the legacy of the pandemic and the rising cost of living? And what do we need to be prepared to do to tackle it? It's very deliberately quite focused on some of the risks and challenges this seminar. So I would say don't get too depressed. There are lots of reasons for optimism too. And we'll talk about some of the ways of mitigating the populist risk here, but we'll also spend a lot more time on that in our third and final seminar next week, which is going to be looking at how to talk quite tangibly about some of the benefits of net zero and the transition. We'll go on to the first slide. Once again, as with last week's presentation, we'll be using the British 7 segments and looking at how they view the issues and topics that we'll be talking about. These segments, for those of you that aren't aware, were developed as part of our Britain's Choice project, which was polling of over 20,000 people now across the country, and also working in collaboration with Climate Outreach on Britain Talks Climate. And the unique thing about the British 7 segments is that, unlike lots of other segmentations, these segments were entirely based not on demographics, but on people's values, social psychology, and starting points. And the reason that we put up their different voting intentions is because it's quite useful to track the British 7 segments onto those segments that are going to be perhaps of most electoral interest as we move into, can you believe it, the second half of this Parliament and the countdown to a general election whenever that might be. And in particular, we're going to focus on, throughout this seminar series, on the established Liberals, who are a group who traditionally have been quite conservative, but started to move away from the Conservatives in 2017, carried on in 2019, and now you see that real decline in support. They're what you might call a blue wall voter, also known as in the press these days as Waitrose woman, although our polling suggests that they actually shop in Tesco. And the second group, who are the Loyal Nationals. It's a group who are quite socially conservative, but actually quite economically sort of more traditionally left-wing, deeply concerned about inequality, for instance. And they're the group of voters who swung quite dramatically the other way at the last general election towards the Conservatives, away from Labour, which had traditionally commanded quite a lot of support amongst this group. But again, you see that climb down. So they're the two groups that we'll be talking about. And in this seminar, we're going to be particularly talking about the Loyal National group, because they're the group who might be in some ways more susceptible to some of the appeals of populism. They are quite a proud, patriotic group, but they also have one of the highest senses of threat perception, insecurity, this sense that the world is changing around them and they're being left behind. And that can create an opening for populist appeal. And we'll also talk a little bit about second group, who are the disengaged traditionalists. So if the Loyal Nationals are your sort of typical red wall voters, disengaged traditionalists perhaps better represent Essex man. It's that group who are quite self-reliant, believe that you get where you get to in life by sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but also strong believers in order and really don't like any sense of disorder or radicalism or challenging the established way of doing things. And together they make up a really significant chunk of the population. So what did we find when we tested various messages around climate change and how they withstood contact with populist attacks? We've gone to this first slide here. It's important to recognize the context in which people are receiving messages about climate, either positively or negatively. Last week, we talked about the cost of living crisis and everything being interpreted for that. The second context is this sense that the system in the UK is rigged. And it's rigged to serve the rich and influential, and things like Partygate, like the Patterson second job scandal, like the PPE scandal have contributed to that. So we now have about 71%, a significant chunk of the population saying that the system is rigged. Those groups who are generally more left-leaning, progressive activists, civic pragmatists, disengaged battlers, you perhaps might expect to say that because the party that they support isn't in power, and obviously you see a lot of that in polling. But perhaps more interestingly, for what we're going to talk about, you see far less of it amongst established liberals, some of whom, the group certainly most likely to probably include themselves amongst the rich and influential, but also that loyal national group, that group who supported the current government, but still thinks that the system is rigged against them. Go to the next slide. You also see this growing sense since the pandemic that the country is going in the wrong direction. I often say that the sort of social capital dividend, which was one of the few bright spots of the pandemic, has actually been to some degree squandered, again, by the revelations that we've heard from things like Partygate, but also from a sense that, just lots of things are going wrong. If you talk to the average member of the public in a focus group, one of the things they'll say is, why don't things work anymore? So you've got this distrust in the elite, but you've also got the sense the UK isn't going in the right direction as well. To the next slide. I can just give you a feel this was a focus group that we ran in Bolton, which just gives you a feeling of how that plays out in terms of where people might start to actually break away from the duopoly of the two main parties.
I think they're all in the same pot at the moment. They're in it for themselves. I can't see them doing anything for us. They just want to further their career. Mm-hmm. And if anyone who gets in the way, and they're not because the only time I've ever voted Conservative was to get us out of Brexit.
Right.
I've always been a Labour supporter, but I can't give my vote to Labour now because they're just as worse. They don't seem to be going in any direction. All they want to do is, like that lady says, is pick bad points about the Conservatives. So
that's interesting. So you say last time was the first time you voted for the Conservatives.
Yeah, for Brexit. Yeah.
Yeah. And will you do again?
No. Well, I think I'll go for one of the independents next time.
No. Okay.
I haven't got one ounce of faith. I mean, I actually crossed with the Conservative Party because of Brexit, and I didn't have much faith in Jeremy Corbyn. And my husband sort of leaned me towards Conservatives, although we've never voted Conservatives. And I just think, my God, I don't want this party and I don't want Labour. Mm-hmm. And maybe I would think of looking at the independent parties because I've got no faith whatsoever.
And so you heard there from, they were two of the people who clearly gave the Prime Minister Boris and the Conservative Party their majority at the last election, really disillusioned. This sense of, Boris was for us, on our side, has drifted away, and people now saying, well, I voted Conservative because, we had to get Brexit done, but now saying that actually we want to look elsewhere. And, they talk about independence, which, very quickly could become a space for a populist alternative. And I think what's quite striking is the numbers saying don't know when you ask them in voting intention, and that steady rise in the numbers who are saying don't know. Again, particularly amongst that loyal national and even more that disengaged traditionalist segment, which creates that opening. If someone can tap into those who, very often they're saying don't know because they're disillusioned with the current offer, there is a space for them as well. Go to the next slide. And we also asked who would be likely to support what was the Brexit Party. A lot of that has now been absorbed into Reform UK, and clearly this is quite low. This is about 5% when we polled in May. But I'd add two caveats to that. One is that we know that the votes for these parties is being slightly artificially suppressed by the fact that they made the wrong call in lockdown. I think they imagined that lots of the kind of red wall voters would support anti-lockdown rhetoric, and in fact the opposite was true. Lots of those red wall voters were among some of the strongest supporters of lockdown and pandemic measures. So I think, you know, as the pandemic fades from view, there's more space for them to grow again. Secondly, you see that amongst, again, those key segments, loyal nationals, as against tradition, is much more likelihood of Conservative voting, actually rising to almost 10% of loyal nationals. And I think the key to remember here is that you don't need a populist party to be in a position where it's going to be actually winning seats in order for it to start to pose a threat to the main parties, because it eats into their votes and makes it more likely that the main parties respond by thinking that they have to pander to those populist parties, that they, you know, for instance, on something like climate change, have to tone down the rhetoric, have to push the deadlines a little bit further along in order to keep the support of those, as I say, you know, those voters who might be thinking about wavering. So that's the challenging context. These numbers are low, and that's reassuring, and we shouldn't panic about them. But that, you know, they don't have to grow that much higher to start becoming a real risk. Go to the next slide, and then you know, just that we touched on this last week, but just to reiterate again, you know, cost of living remains the top issue for every segment. And you take cost of living, you take Partygate, you take that sense that the system is rigged, you do create the perfect storm. And of course, the last time we saw that perfect storm was in the wake of the financial crisis, and the result was that embrace of populism, you know, the aftershocks, which we're still seeing playing out today. So what does that mean when it comes to climate? How does sort of populism play into that? Because we know that, you know, particularly Farage, the Brexit Party, Richard Tice, and others have embraced the anti-net zero rhetoric. What are the do's and don'ts in terms of tackling it? As I said, this is part one. We'll do a bit more next week on part two in terms of how you talk about this. And I think the first one is don't be complacent about the consensus. We are, you know, we're in a great place in the UK when it comes to public support for transition and tackling climate change. No small part down to the hard work of lots of the climate campaigners who'll be watching this. But let's not be complacent. And let me show you why. The first thing is very positive, is that you know, pro-climate messages trump anti-climate messages. And so as much as we say don't be complacent, don't panic. And in particular, and this obviously won't surprise lots of you, it's particularly when you focus climate change around protecting animals and wildlife, you get really strong support, combined with extreme weather as well, but also a chance to live sort of happier lives. And again, won't surprise many of you, but some of those more those arguments more couched in Britain playing a leading role in the world stage don't necessarily have people disagreeing, but have more people saying that they're not sure, and lower levels of overall support. Then when we go on to the sort of anti-climate messages, so the first thing to say is, you know, as you can see, that when you compare them with the pro-climate messages, people are much more split. But you know, what struck me getting this polling back was that actually for, you know, at least three of the messages, you've got more people supporting the anti-climate change messages, saying they agree than they disagree with those messages. And you've got a significant number who are somewhere in the middle. And, you know, again, that normally suggests that they could go either way. And unsurprisingly, and this links back to what we talked about last week, you know, the most potentially damaging, you know, the arguments which have the most purchase are this sense that it's going to make the rich richer, that climate change is going to be, well, measures to tackle climate change are going to be punishing the poor. And actually, particularly when you look at vulnerable people like the elderly or, you know, young people left paying debts as well, they're the ones who do it. Again, I always find this reassuring. There's this sense of, you know, will the argument that, you know, China and others aren't doing anything land? Actually, that was the anti-message which got the least support. So it is very much rooted domestically in what's it mean for British people, and they're the messages there. Go on to the next slide. There's sort of, again, I think the reassuring, optimistic, positive side of the story is that messages which are against pushing back deadlines score a lot higher than messages in favour of pushing back deadlines. And by that we mean things like, phasing out the use of gas boilers, switching to EVs. I guess the overall target for reaching net zero. You can see the actual question asked in the bottom of the slide. And strikingly, and I think this is one takeaway for how we respond to this, it is the kind of populist message against pushing back deadlines that has the most resonance. So if you look there, by far the strongest is this sense of we have to do this because otherwise big business and politicians won't do anything. They'll just try and shirk responsibility. Actually has higher agreement than the second one, which is actually about the problem being made worse. So there's definitely, things that we can play with, things that we can use in terms of how we, I think lots of us are aware that the greatest threat, I think, to our ambition of reaching net zero is not that, politicians say we're not going to do it anymore. It's that they say, oh, we'll have another 2 years or another 3 years, and the can gets kicked down the road with all of the consequences for temperature rises that we all know that entails. So I think, that's a way of pushing back on that. Looking the other way at some of the messages in favour of pushing back the deadline, it was that sense of, gosh, people have been through so much. They've been through the pandemic. We've got the cost of living crisis. Can't we just give people a bit of a breather? That sense that the public are really exhausted. And again, that highlights that very real risk that we face here, is that people just sort of say, I want to get off. And we talked last week about, how do you, pitch climate change in a way which actually looks like it's going to address the problems that people face rather than making them worse. I think that's even more important here. But as is, and Conleth will talk about this a little bit more as well, playing into that sense is we're not talking about Brexit, pandemic, cost of living, and now reaching net zero. Actually reaching net zero is not going to be this big, amazing, sort of big bang thing, which, some advocates might like to portray it as. Go to the next slide. We also looked at this idea of a net zero referendum. Not because we think it's necessarily likely that happens, but we wouldn't want to be caught off guard if it becomes, if you do get it promoted, particularly in the context perhaps of a conservative leadership contest, that might be somewhere where it becomes an issue, but also because it's another way of getting at people's support and potential vulnerabilities, we need to say. And the first thing I'd say is that, look at these figures. They do look sort of scarily high in terms of, when you test people deserve a say in a referendum. Sometimes you get, actually quite high levels of support for it, approaching 50%. You get that in a lot of polling questions. In general, if you ask the public, should the public have a say on something, they're likely to say yes, they should. And then when you dig into it a bit deeper in the core, they're like, well, actually, that might be something for people in Westminster to do. So I wouldn't be unduly alarmed, but they do show you perhaps some of the kind of risks and challenges that we focus on. The best message that we tested against that is this sense that we don't have time to waste on a referendum, that actually would be a distraction, but actually, some support as well for this idea that, we've had enough politics and division over the past few years. But interestingly, a bit mixed on this suggestion of, is climate change too complex to put in a referendum context? So again, not to be unduly concerned, but to recognise that actually, it's about 50-50, even when you test messages against having a referendum, and really leaning into that. We just don't have time to have a referendum, which isn't, and I think this is quite important, that's not because people necessarily buy into the most radical version of transition, that we need to act now and we need radical change immediately. It's more because people saw the waste of the Brexit years and the endless debate, and they don't want to go back to that. So, not just the division, but the sense it was, 4 years and still ongoing, with the Northern Ireland stuff, although not for as many people. But, this sense of it was just such wasted time. And I think that appeals, that appeals to people as a message against referenda in general. We also tested specifically messages about Nigel Farage given he has emerged as one of the sort of champions of the sort of anti-net zero campaign. And we actually think, Farage is very good at building grassroots support, which parliamentarians opposed to net zero can then pick up on and use. But also, and I think this is more pertinent, any sign of, Farage reboot, I think, is what could potentially spook part of the centre-right here, the Conservative Party, into thinking we need to play this net zero stuff down. And what I would say is, again, you look at this graph, these graphs, and you see, okay, most people actually oppose Farage messages. I mean, Farage is not, when viewed across the population, a popular figure. But actually, you see, there is that significant chunk of the population, sort of 20% or so, saying, oh, he was right on Brexit and he'll be right on net zero. He's a man of the people. And in particular, if you look at that last graph where there's the strongest block, he stands up for working class people across the country against wealthy and out of touch Londoners. Still, more disagree than agree, but taken together with the don't knows, you've got a significant pool there, which is a worry. And then if you look at messages the other way, anti-Farage messages again, it flips the other way. More people agree with these anti-Farage messages that climate change will only get worse. Actually, doesn't really care about working class people. But again, substantial numbers disagree. And I think what's really striking is that none of those anti-Farage messages got more than 50% support, not more than 50% of people disagreeing with them. So there is that space there, whether it is Farage's latest reboot or someone who tries to pick up his mantle. Go to the next slide. And then in particular here, we said at the beginning that it was that loyal national disengaged traditionalist segment who perhaps the segment of the population most at risk of being attracted to these populist anti-net zero messages. And you see kind of across the board that sort of consistently higher support for those pro-Farage messages. If you look at that, the loyal nationals on he was right about Brexit and will be right again on net zero, really, almost half of loyal nationals, that red wall voter group, agreeing with that. And again, on that idea of him standing up for working class people, you get the loyal nationals and disengaged traditionalists who are the groups most likely to think that the country is being led by out-of-touch Londoners who leave working class people behind. You get that agreement with that messages. So there is definitely, a space there. The next slide. So how do we go about tackling it other than not being complacent, recognizing that the risk is there? Perhaps counterintuitively, I think our first bit of advice from all the research that we've done is don't make climate a dividing line. Don't let it fall into a sort of polarizing trap, because the moment that, as we know, you polarize something and it becomes a culture war, you get people on either side, and it then purely depends on whether your side is winning or not, whether the issue advances. At the moment, we're in this very lucky position where across the political mainstream, there's support for tackling climate change. And I think that's particularly important if we go to the next slide here, is that most Britons aren't that political. They don't want to, something like climate change, they don't want to be forced to see through a party political lens. And I think they can when, as campaigners, particularly for progressive causes, this idea of what we should be doing is making the next election a bidding war on climate change. I actually think there are lots of risks of that. Firstly, because most people don't, as I said, they don't see it through a political lens at the moment. They don't, as you can see from this graph, have particularly strong attachments to a political party, to one party or the other. So I think that and actually forcing it through that political lens could just put a lot of block. But the flip side is, for those people who do see it through a political lens, once one party is seen as the good climate party and the bad climate party, you're more likely to get their partisan supporters saying, oh, well, given my party's not the climate party, I won't support it either. So I think there are real risks to this idea of, is 2024 a climate election? Actually, 2024 should be about building on the consensus that we've already got. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over, having presented perhaps some of the challenges, Conleth is going to start guiding us through some more of the solutions and ways forward. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Luke. So in our work, both the qualitative research, we've got a host of, or a series of regular focus groups on many of these issues, and in our polling, what we pick up are some worrying signs about conspiracy theories and conspiracy style thinking and disinformation when it comes to climate. So regularly in focus groups, we hear about kind of conspiracies theories being talked about more generally. The two most prominent ones that have featured recently are those of the Great Reset, and then the false accusations about Keir Starmer's non-prosecution of Jimmy Savile whenever he was director of public prosecution. So both of those are coming up in groups right across the country. So we polled a series of questions in order to try and get the sense of, well, how many people had heard about this, how many people believed it, and then to think more broadly about what does this mean for climate disinformation and conspiracy thinking related to climate issues more broadly. So almost a fifth of the population had heard about the Great Reset. 2/5 of those two-fifths of that number can tell us correctly what the Great Reset actually is, choosing from a list of one correct definition and four definitions that weren't correct. And of that broader fifth, there's about a kind of amounts to 4% of the population who actually believe that the Great Reset theory, or the Great Reset conspiracy theory, is completely or partly true. And when it comes to the Savile accusations, there's a fifth who believe that they believe that those accusations to be true, including 29% of loyal nationals and 37% of backbone conservatives. So it's a significant number of people who have heard about these conspiracy theories and these examples of disinformation more generally, and then another kind of a not insignificant number of people who actually believe them. So what does this, what relevance does this have for climate? I'll show you a focus group that we did recently in Hitchin, where our concerns were realised a bit.
That's better. Yeah, I the same. I cycle and walk almost everywhere these days. I hardly use my car anymore. And yeah, recycling, all of the things that you try and do. And of course, with the higher prices, we're all trying to use less petrol, less heating, less electricity. So it's almost like they put it up so that we don't use it anymore. Not that I'm cynical or anything.
Well, all the input that's been put in by what other people have said, it is try and think before you use the car. Do I need to take the car? On a day like today, you could just walk down to the town centre and walk back, which is health-wise good for you as well. And it almost does seem like the petrol's going so high. I'm just wondering if it's like being forced on us. So
at this stage, this kind of concern about is there some greater plan here is at a very initial stage. It's only a cynical or skeptical question in this focus group. In other focus groups, it's more outright in making the claim that actually this whole, all of these changes that we're being asked to make, there's some big plan here. And the people who in focus groups have told us about the Great Reset believe them with great conviction. But the risk that we've identified in this is particularly when navigating this cost of living crisis, when prices are going up and, behaviours are changing as a result of cost of living concerns. There is a risk of making everything about climate, and an even bigger risk of celebrating the fact that people have had to change their behaviours. We know that people will have to change their behaviours over a period of time in order to reach net zero. But what we need to be careful about is doing the communications about that behaviour change in a way that doesn't feed these conspiracy theories, or create a context where the anti-climate populists can really thrive off that conspiracy style thinking. And you can see here that there has been a significant growth in the belief that the government is doing too much about climate change. It was much higher around COP26 in November, but remains significant. It remains quite high, and it is higher among those right-leaning groups of the Loyal Nationals, the disengaged traditionalists, and the backbone conservatives. So that is one to be wary of, and to act with caution whenever we're talking about those examples of behaviour change. Now, part of the project that we've been doing is about trying to learn the lessons of COVID, and to see how they might be applied across net zero transition and a host of other issues, and now including the war in Ukraine. And you can see here that there are groups who are more likely to be suspicious about whether the truth about COVID has been hidden from us more broadly. The Loyal National group in particular, and the disengaged battler group, who are sceptical about the fact that that the public was told the truth about COVID. Many of them, almost a majority in both the disengaged battlers and the Loyal National groups, who believe that the truth about COVID-19 has been hidden from the public. And at the start of this year, there was kind of broader concern about whether the scientists getting it wrong, particularly on Omicron, and the severity of Omicron, was going to lead to a broader erosion in trust in science. And so, part of this is quite encouraging. 80% of people, 4 in 5 people in the UK, are proud of the work that scientists and science has done in order to guide the country through the pandemic. And you see that in focus groups as well. Whenever you talk to people, they talk with great pride about vaccines, about the vaccine rollout, and about many of the actions that doctors, the NHS, scientists were able to do in order to save thousands of lives during the pandemic. But there is a significant minority, so it's 21% here, but a quarter among Loyal Nationals, disengaged traditionalists, and disengaged battlers, who think that if we listen to the scientists, we'd still be in lockdown. There's a skepticism about the role that science played during the pandemic. So we asked that group of people, that relatively small minority, but nonetheless significant, whether that had any bearing on their trust in scientists, for trusting science for climate reasons. And you can see there that half of the Loyal Nationals who thought that scientists got it wrong during COVID now believe that it means that we can't trust scientists when it comes to climate. And there is kind of a helpful strategic communications point here, is that if the only messengers who are talking about climate are scientists, it's not going to reach that group of people. And so it's trying to identify both the messengers and the messages that are going to reach to those people who are a bit more skeptical about scientists because of the COVID situation. And again, with the backbone conservative group who have a significantly higher agreement. Those who thought science got it wrong, they think that it means we can't trust them on climate issues. So that's another area to be cautious about and to develop strategic communication strategies on. So more positively, we think that there is a strong need to talk about transition in a way that is manageable and orderly. Now, last week in the webinar, Luke talked through the exhaustion that we find in focus groups, that we also see in the polling, where people have this sense that the country, the services aren't being provided. The strikes this week will kind of contribute to that broader feeling that things aren't working, that there's a real backlog in the country, and that people are exhausted by a series of crises that have dominated the last number of years, from Brexit to the pandemic, to the cost of living crisis, to the war in Ukraine. And within that context, it becomes harder for the climate movement more generally, and for climate activists themselves to talk about another big change. The public are much less receptive to talking about another big change now, entering the third year of the pandemic, and with a war in Europe and a cost of living crisis that is their number one priority. So that's why we now see that whenever you talk about building on the progress that we've made in recent years, making that positive story about that we have taken steps and we have made some progress, building on that, a message that taps into that building on narrative, and that talks about a pace of change that the country doesn't think is another huge radical change, is much more supported across the public and in a more consistent way than talking about radical change to catch up with time that has already been wasted. Luke was talking through the messages that worked previously, and not wasting time in the future is a positive message that adds support. But talking about time we have already wasted seems to reduce support among most of the groups, apart from progressives. And one very practical way of doing that is to talk about the stuff that people are doing. So in focus groups and in polling, we always get the story about recycling being something that makes Britons proud. And often whenever we share this with our partners in the climate movement, there's a feeling of despair in some and distress for others, because we know that recycling in and of itself is not going to be the kind of behaviour change that we need in order to reach net zero. It's going to contribute, but it's not going to be enough. Similar arguments are made about the public's concern about plastics in the ocean. Our recommendation here is not to talk recycling down and to be very disciplined in not talking recycling down. We think that there's a lot to learn about the public's pride in their recycling behaviours, and we should kind of think about how that can be applied across the board. One way of what the public tell us in focus groups and in our polling is that they want clear rules from the government in order for us to transition. And that's majorities across the board in all of the 7 segments about the need for clear rules to get us to make sure that we can tackle climate change. And with recycling, they tell us they have clear rules, they can see, they understand those rules, the rules are enforced by the local councils, and they can see that their neighbours are also abiding by the rules as well. So clarity in the rules and rules that are enforced is the lesson that comes from climate change that can be applied across behaviour changes to build up support there. And the other popular approach, which might seem quite counterintuitive if you listen to political or elite debates on some of these issues, is that the public are open to banning their way to net zero on certain issues. So when it talks about banning single-use plastics, they tell us in focus groups that if you really wanted to get rid of single-use plastics, then why haven't you banned them already? For some of the public, it's a sense check. Like, if you really mean something, you're going to ban it. It's a sign of your intent and resolve, that's clearer than just talking about, oh, you should do this. And it's also a clear, orderly way of doing transition where there are very clear rules that are applied. Obviously, bans can't be applied on all issues. Obviously, bans won't be popular in every policy area, but using bans strategically in trying to create the impression that this transition can be orderly and it can be manageable and achievable for the public is a way of building and securing that mandate over a series of years and decades, which is the nature of this transition. The other thing that we want to highlight is just not to fall into populist traps. And partly this is about who is doing the talking about climate transition, about net zero transition, and what do the public think about these people. So in our polling last November, and some of you might have seen this before already, the public are split on whether the climate movement is welcoming to them. And worryingly for the climate movement in the UK, it is the least welcoming of the 6 European countries that we surveyed last November. And And this is kind of contributed to in large part by the public's views on Extinction Rebellion. So you see that twice as many people think that Extinction Rebellion has been a force for bad in the last year than a force for good. And so what can we do about this? Well, one is that we need to diversify the messengers who are talking about climate change. If the only messengers that we have are climate activists, the public already have a coldness of feeling towards them. You see here that on a temperature thermometer from 100 being very warm feelings to 0 being very cold feelings, the public are at the much lower end when it comes to climate change protesters. But on conservationists, they're on the much higher end. So on similar questions, farmers, there's a warmth towards farmers, there's a warmth towards supermarket workers, there's a warmth towards teachers. There are people who can talk about climate in a way that resonates with the public and can build support, not lose the support. And that kind of complacency argument really does extend very practically into the people who are talking about climate change here. And the more broader point is about how much of kind of transition we put into the kind of political basket. You know, there is a choice to be made about who fronts the climate transition, and there is a real risk that if it's only politicians who are going to front much of the kind of climate transition policy, then it's at risk of becoming unpopular quite quickly, given the very low levels of trust that the public have at the minute. The public have very low levels of trust in senior politicians, and this other graph shows that they also feel that these people are out of touch. In a cost of living crisis where that feeling only grows, it becomes much harder for politicians to make progress on building the broader societal mandate for net zero transition. And so our advice here is about embedding this into different messengers and having different kind of issues here, and also about disaggregating net zero transition into smaller building blocks for the public. Some of them will be more popular, some of them will be less popular, but by aggregating it all together and making it a big bang style approach to net zero transition that firstly scares people because it seems bigger and less manageable than before, but also makes it more vulnerable to shifts in support for politicians and political parties who are leading the charge on that big agenda at any one time. And so actually making it into more manageable blocks is likely to increase support. And the other thing when it comes to politics is about insulating climate from accusations of sleaze. And so we asked these series of questions here about whether people thought this would be, these actions happening or these things happening would be a price worth paying or not worth paying for transition. And so politicians making money from lobbying on environmental issues is not a price worth paying, according to the public. It's this joint top most unacceptable consequence of transition, alongside farmers losing their farms. And so the premium that places on the climate movement is to be absolutely built in braces on making sure that accusations of sleaze cannot tarnish any kind of advocacy or lobbying that's happening on green issues, because that will be really corrosive to public support more broadly for net zero transition. So that's part one of what we think can be done about some of the populist risks to our climate mandate in the UK. In 10 days' time, we'll have our next webinar and our final webinar on how to talk about the benefits of net zero in a way that resonates with the public. And that will be the kind of conclusion to what we think needs to be done at this moment to really secure our broad mandate, both politically and socially, for net zero transition in the UK. So thanks for joining, and we hope to see you at the next one.